Here's a great video of Joe Rogan interviewing Dave Smith about the war in Ukraine and NATO. Nazi aggression is the reason for the war in Ukraine.
It went super viral, and I heard back from some people who disagreed. But the funny thing about it is that it's not like when I was talking about like NATO expansion and how much of a provocation this was to the Russians. Last time I was on the show, I talked a lot about this, the like kind of the cause of this war in Ukraine, and I put a lot of blame on American foreign policy, and it went super viral, and I heard back from some people who disagreed. But the funny thing about it is that it's not like when I was talking about like NATO expansion and how much of a provocation this was to the Russians. When you were talking about like the good people in government, it's not like it's just kooks or crazy libertarians like me. It was not just like Ron Paul and Noam Chomsky and Pat Buchanan, like the outsiders who were all against NATO expansion. But the list of people within the government, within the national security apparatus, who completely opposed NATO expansion is really impressive and long. There's a lot of like really wise people within the government who were completely against NATO expansion in the 90s when it first started. At least 3 secretaries of defense, Robert McNamara, Robert Gates, George W. Bush and Barack Obama's Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense at the time, they all opposed it in like the strongest possible language and all explicitly for the reason that this will provoke a conflict with Russia. And they were like, George Kennan, who was the founder of the containment strategy, old school Cold Warrior. There's this great interview he gave with Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. You can find it online. And it's in the 90s when they're doing the first round of NATO expansion. And he is like furious. Like his anger comes through the page when you're reading it. Because he's like, what are you guys doing? We won the Cold War. We won. And now you're picking a fight with Russia, and this isn't Vladimir Putin's Russia, this was Boris Yeltsin, and he's like, these aren't the Soviets, these aren't the communists, these are the heroes who overthrew them. Why are we picking a fight with them? And he was a Cold Warrior. He was like, you're throwing away my life's work. And he said, and this was a really, a crazy prediction, really ominous. He said, the people who are advocating expanding NATO are going to continue advocating expanding it and expanding it and expanding it. And then there will be a Russian reaction. And then when there's the Russian reaction, they're going to say, see, that's proof that we have to keep expanding it. And damn, if he wasn't right. If he wasn't right about that. And but one more little detail on this, because this is really interesting, is so there's in 2008, in February of 2008, there was a private cable that the current CIA head, Burns, Bill Burns, who's currently the head of the CIA, at the time he was the ambassador to Russia. And so he sent a private message to Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State at the time. And the only reason we know about this is because of the heroic Julian Assange dumped this. So this was not for the public. This is like what they were saying to each other. And this memo was titled, Niet means Niet. And it was about Ukrainian entry into NATO, because this had been floated out for a while. Yeah, there you go. Basically, the whole piece is the current CIA director telling Condoleezza Rice that this, and he's saying it in diplomatic language.
Read it for
yeah. So he says, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences, which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. So there's another memo that comes out later that year where he says, and it's a really interesting thing, where he said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines. And Burns says to Condoleezza Rice, again, not to the American public, just to let the Secretary of State know, like, this is what I'm saying. He goes, I've spoken to everyone over here. He goes, from the craziest right-wingers to Putin's sharpest liberal critics. And it is unanimous to a man. They all agree that Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of red lines, that this is a direct threat to Russia. You cannot do this. In the same way Jack Kennedy was saying, you cannot put missiles in Cuba, you cannot bring Ukraine into your military alliance. That was Putin's position. Then this is what they were telling him. And 3 months after that memo that we were just reading, so this was in February, they had the Bucharest summit where NATO announced that Georgia and Ukraine were coming into NATO. And this is what, it's like our ambassador to Russia told our Secretary of State, do not do this. And then they went, we're just announcing that we're going to do it. And 3 months after that was the war in Georgia, because they announced Georgia and Ukraine were coming in. And then Georgia got ballsy, because they felt like they had the backing of the West, and they attacked a breakaway province, South Ossetia, and they had Russian peacekeepers there, and Vladimir Putin responded. That was like the first real response. And he went to war with Georgia over that. And then, like the stuff we talked about last time, is when in 2014, when there was the coup, backed by the West in Ukraine. It's what I like about these segments too is people can argue with like this, because I know there are people arguing with me. The last time I was here, if you remember, we played the video of Gideon Rose just bragging about this, and he was like, "Dude, it's not me. That's the CIA director's words. Yeah. That's Gideon. That's the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine saying this. This is what people in the government were saying." And one more note that I'll say is that Bill Clinton, Secretary of Defense, he wrote about this in 2015. So this is after the coup in Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution, and after Putin took Crimea. And he basically said that, this is all my fault. And that his biggest regret was that he didn't resign over NATO expansion. I think he said his biggest regret was that he didn't do everything he could to stop it, and that he didn't ultimately resign over it, because this was destined to be the future. That it was people will say, I know people will argue with me on this, and they'll say NATO is just a defensive alliance, so why should Vladimir Putin care if we expand this defensive alliance? And it's yeah, it's a defensive alliance, except for all the times it's not. Except for all the times it fights aggressive wars like in Serbia or Libya or Afghanistan. Other than that, I guess, they claim it's a defensive alliance. But from Vladimir Putin's perspective, this isn't a defensive voluntary alliance. This is the European wing of the American empire, the most war-hungry country in the world, who's started 7 wars in the last 20 years and slaughtered millions of people. From his perspective, when you put dual-use rocket launchers in Poland, that's not we're just trying, the official reason is we're just trying to make sure that Iran can't nuke Europe with the nukes that they don't have. But from Putin's perspective, he's no, you're trying to cut down on the time it would take for a nuclear weapon to hit Moscow. And so again, it's not that Putin's a good guy, because he's not. It's not that he's justified in invading Ukraine. He's not. And all the stories of horrible shit that you've heard that he's done there, he's probably done a lot of them. But, man, it's just that all these guys, these same dumb neocons who had this policy to remake the Middle East, they're the same ones who also had the policy to expand NATO all the way to Russia's border. And, man, was just the dumbest, most reckless policy ever that's now put us in a position where we are closer to a risk of World War III and nuclear war than we've ever been in my life. And for what? For what? To make sure that the Donbass region is ruled by Kiev rather than Moscow? Is that really worth it? Jesus Christ.
Uniparty neocons are suicidal and don't care about a nuclear war in order to keep Nazis attacking the ethnic Russians who live in East Ukraine after they already voted 90% to 10 to be independent and not Russian. Our government backed Nazis in Ukraine and they bombed 14,000 civilians, men, women, and children, not military bases. They were killing civilians for the last 9 years. 14,000. Little babies, old women, and old men. Most of them all retirees. NATO Nazis, that's what I call them. Help me get this video viral and share it with the world. Maybe Joe Rogan could wake up the average everyday guy, Democrat and Republican, to say no mas. Niet means niet. No means no.